Most pregnancy advice tells you what to stop doing or what to buy. Almost none of it mentions the one daily practice with peer-reviewed research behind it, something that costs nothing, takes 20 minutes, and produces measurable changes in the developing fetal brain that persist long after birth. The fetal auditory cortex does not wait for birth to begin building the machinery of language. It starts in the womb, using whatever acoustic material the environment provides, and the quality of that material directly shapes the neural architecture your baby arrives with. Reading aloud is not the same input as ordinary conversation. The research is specific about why, and the difference matters enormously for what the developing brain is actually building during those weeks. What makes prosodic richness a structurally different signal than casual speech for a developing auditory cortex? What did DeCasper and Spence find when they tested newborns for traces of a text heard only before birth? And how specific was what those babies had retained? And what does a structural trace in a fetal brain actually mean for the language architecture a child builds years later? To understand any of this, we first need to go inside the process the developing auditory cortex is running right now, quietly, automatically, from around 8 loud. Not reading near your baby, not playing an audiobook in the background, reading aloud yourself in your own voice for roughly 20 uninterrupted minutes consistently across the weeks of the third trimester. The research on what this specific practice does to the developing fetal auditory system and the neural architecture it builds for language is more precise and more consequential than almost anything else in the prenatal development literature. And almost nobody talks about it. To understand why reading aloud has this particular effect, you have to understand something that most parents learn too late. The fetal brain does not wait for birth to start building the machinery of language. It begins constructing that machinery in the womb, using whatever acoustic material the environment provides. And the quality of that material, how rich it is in linguistic structure, how varied its rhythms and sound patterns, how consistently it repeats across days and weeks, directly shapes the neural architecture the baby arrives with. The developing auditory cortex is running a process researchers call statistical learning. From around 18 to 20 weeks onward, it is cataloging the sounds it hears most frequently, mapping the rhythmic and phonemic patterns that repeat across exposure after exposure, and using that information to begin building a predictive model of what language sounds like. It is doing this continuously, automatically, without instruction, the way a developing muscle builds itself in response to use. What it is building, specifically, is the neural foundation for phonemic awareness, the ability to hear and distinguish the individual sound units that make up words. This capacity is one of the strongest known predictors of reading ability in childhood, and its roots, the research increasingly suggests, reach back into the prenatal period. Dr. Patricia Kuhl at the University of Washington has studied the timeline of this process in detail. Her work established that by birth, the fetal auditory cortex has already tuned itself to the phonemic landscape of the mother's native language, showing stronger neural responses to the sound categories of that language than to those of an unfamiliar one. The tuning is not vague. It is specific, measurable, and the product of months of statistical learning inside the womb. But here is where reading aloud in particular becomes significant. Ordinary conversation, the daily texture of speech the fetal auditory system is exposed to, tends to be informal, repetitive in its vocabulary, and relatively narrow in its prosodic range. The topics are practical, the sentences are short, the rhythms are familiar and predictable. This is perfectly adequate input for the basic processes of prenatal language mapping, and it produces real developmental effects on its own. Reading aloud is different in 3 specific ways that matter enormously for the developing brain. The first is prosodic richness. Written language, when spoken, carries a more varied and structured melodic contour than casual conversation. Sentences are longer, clause structures are more complex. The rhythm shifts more deliberately between phrases. The developing auditory cortex, exposed to this richer prosodic input, is building a more detailed map of what language can sound like, one that encompasses a wider range of the structural patterns it will eventually need to process and produce. The second is lexical exposure. Books, even simple ones read aloud during pregnancy, expose the fetal auditory system to a broader range of word forms than ordinary conversation typically provides. The fetal brain cannot yet attach meaning to those word forms. That process comes after birth, as auditory patterns get linked to objects and experiences in the world. But the word forms themselves are being encoded as acoustic patterns. They are entering the statistical model the auditory cortex is building, and those patterns, already familiar at the neural level, will have a measurable head start when meaning-making begins. The third is consistency of repetition. When the same text is read aloud repeatedly, the same book, the same passage, the same poem across multiple sessions, the fetal auditory system receives the same complex acoustic pattern more than once. And repetition is the mechanism through which statistical learning converts exposure into encoding. The more times a pattern appears, the more strongly it is weighted in the brain's predictive model. The more durably it is represented in the developing neural architecture. This is the mechanism behind one of the most often cited findings in prenatal learning research. In 1986, psychologist Anthony DeCasper and his colleague Melanie Spence recruited pregnant mothers and asked them to read a specific passage of children's literature aloud twice daily for the final 6 weeks of pregnancy, roughly 40 readings total. After birth, they tested whether newborns showed a preference for that passage over a different passage they had not heard before birth, using the same pacifier-sucking paradigm that had been used in earlier studies. The newborns chose the familiar passage, specifically, reliably. They had encoded not just the sound of the mother's voice, but the particular acoustic structure of a text they had heard repeatedly in the final weeks of fetal life. What the DeCasper and Spence study demonstrated was not only that prenatal learning occurred, that had been shown before, but that it was specific enough and durable enough to survive the enormous neurological disruption of birth and remain detectable in a newborn's behavior hours later. The fetal brain had held on to something, and what it had held on to was the product of deliberate, repeated, structured auditory exposure, exactly the kind that 20 minutes of daily reading aloud produces. The research since that landmark study has continued to build the case. A 2013 study by Aino Partanen and colleagues at the University of Helsinki used EEG to measure the neural responses of newborns to sounds they had been exposed to in utero. Infants whose mothers had repeated specific sound patterns during pregnancy showed detectably different neural processing of those patterns after birth, stronger, more differentiated responses that revealed a brain already shaped by what it had heard. The prenatal exposure had not just passed through the auditory system and disappeared. It had left a structural trace. And a structural trace in the auditory cortex is not a trivial thing. The neural architecture for processing language, the networks that will eventually support phoneme discrimination, word recognition, sentence comprehension, and ultimately reading, is built incrementally, over years, from the ground up. The foundation it is built on is the auditory experience of the early period. And the early period, the research is clear, begins before birth. This means that 20 minutes of reading aloud per day across the third trimester is not a gift you are giving your baby in some vague and unquantifiable sense. It is a specific, measurable input into a developmental process that is actively underway, a process that will shape the neural infrastructure your baby arrives with, and that infrastructure will shape how readily the architecture of language builds itself in the months and years that follow. You do not need to choose a special text. You do not need to perform or modulate your voice in any particular way. You do not need to hold the book against your belly or position yourself at a specific angle. You simply need to speak, in your own voice, in the language your baby will be born into, consistently enough for the statistical learning process to do what it was designed to do. The book you have been meaning to read anyway, the article you find interesting, the novel that has been sitting on the nightstand. Any of these, read aloud in a quiet room for 20 minutes a day, becomes something more than reading. It becomes the most targeted developmental input you can offer a fetal brain that is, right now, actively building the foundations of language from the inside out. Your voice is the architecture. Your words are the material. And the brain being built from them will carry what it learned in the dark before it ever opened its eyes for the rest of its life. If this gave you a new way of seeing those 20 minutes, consider subscribing. We release new videos every week on the hidden science of your baby's developing mind. And a quick like genuinely helps other parents find this channel. Thanks for being here.